without further ado, if we could welcome Jennifer Capps. Carol, good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. Well, this morning we have a fun little short, very short film that I'm going to play here in a second, but I'll tell you just a little bit about that before we hit play. George Albert Smith was an English stage hypnotist, psychic, and magic lantern show. So kind of an interesting guy with those things in his repertoire. But he did a series of short films, so he's an early film movie person. He did short films from 1897 to 1903. And in that time period, he pioneered film editing and close-ups. And he did also the first development of a successful color film process in 1908, actually. So he was an early innovator in that field. And the short film of Santa Claus is from 1898. And I'm going to go ahead and hit play. So in 1898, the children are going to bed. Small stage.
Small bed.
And then notice the effect of the darkening room.
Wow.
And he was an innovator having this split screen, having two action areas that was in his film editing process. So this was very innovative for that time period.
Slides down that chimney.
Very cool.
And put there Santa.
There's stockings on their beds and not in the fireplace. And they had a fireplace there. So
behind the placard.
correct.
And their post Santa has left, and the children awake.
They're clapping.
So short film there, but very fun. So going along with Harrison, thinking about that time period, you know, if this is 1898, of course he's an English film person, but Santa and how he's dressed and how things looked and how they were interpreting Christmas at that time. Of course, you have Thomas Nast, who is a cartoonist who is doing drawings of Santa Claus at that time as well. So in December of 1891, President Harrison actually spoke to a New York journalist about Christmas. And in that, he revealed that he was going to be Santa Claus himself for the children. And really wanted to make it special for them there as well. So one of the other items that we have not had too long in our collection, actually just since like last year, is a book by Colonel William Crook. It's his memoirs. Colonel Crook actually was President Lincoln's bodyguard in 1865. By the way, he was off duty the night of the major so he had no control over that. But he continued to work at the White House for 50 years and served 12 presidents. So he was a bodyguard in the early years. He was in the Army. And then, when Grant became president, he was appointed to be executive clerk of the President of the United States. And then he was a chief distributing officer, which he held that office for many years. So he was in the White House during Harrison's administration. And so in his wonderful book, he talks about the Harrisons and Christmas. And he remembers that first Christmas there. He said the first Christmas tree that was ever lifted up by its gift-laden green in the White House. And his many memories of his many years of service, that stood out to him as being one of the most pleasant memories he had, was that first Christmas in the White House with the Harrisons. And he remembered Harrison as being a warm-hearted and sympathetic to those who he knew, and that he had a merry side to his nature, and with that a love of childhood. And then I'm going to go ahead and open up here and read a little bit of this to him. He talks about who was there for the first White House Christmas. So of course you have the grandchildren, May, Harrison Russell's wife, Mary McKee, Mary Demick is there, Dr. Scott, Caroline's father, is there. And so he says, you know, for a few days before, the children are growing more and more excited and hoping that Santa Claus would bring them lots of gifts. And the night before, they actually start working on it. So somehow he says that afternoon passed, supper was disposed of, and Christmas Eve stories were told while stockings were hung. And at last, the little people drowsily went to bed, still wondering, still hoping what they might wake up to. And hoping that just the moment that dear old Santa would be coming down the chimney, that they might wake up and see what he had left. But he saw it Christmas morning, as others did in the office as well. And he talks about how lovely the Christmas tree was, and how that, again, was just an impression for him to see that. You know, they decorated all night. He said that President Harrison worked like a little beaver, decorating the Christmas tree as well. So they were all in there hurrying away and working on that Christmas decoration. And he says, I have often wished that those who sometimes call President Harrison a human iceberg could have seen him at that time, and at many other times when he threw aside his official reserve. So he saw that warm-hearted side of Benjamin Harrison and has those wonderful Christmas memories of him as well. So that's a wonderful little account from Colonel Crook. And some of you might remember we actually got a chair that Benjamin Harrison gave to him that the family just donated last year, year before, and it's up on the 3rd floor. So that is up there too. So he gave that to him as a gift later. So Christmas Day, going back a little bit to 1888 when they're still here, many of you have heard me talk about the spider webs and the spider web story. So in 1888, Benjamin Harrison received a special gift that was of interest to elected President Harrison. It was a box containing a miniature kit of cabinet maker's tools and an unsigned note accompanying it that said the general might find it serviceable for making up his cabinet. And then later that evening, they also received another gift from a good friend in Portland, Oregon, it says, and the gift was a spider web made of very fine wire with a spider and a fly in very close proximity to each other, and the words "Home Sweet Home" that were spun into the web, and instructions that it be hung by the parlor door. And of course, you have that old adage of the spider telling the fly, "Will you walk into my parlor?" And I think it's the idea of Harrison going to Washington, into the web of Washington. So someone sent him the cabinet tools to make up his cabinet, and we're talking about, you know, the web of Washington that he was walking into. But then later, in the 1890s, Ike Hoover, who installed the electric lights at the White House, actually made a spider for them at Christmas time and made the body of the spider a red light. So while they didn't necessarily have lights on their Christmas tree at the White House, he was adding electricity and made this spider that had a red light. So we have replicated that spider upstairs in the back parlor, and we have a spider with a red light, and hopefully the batteries last, that hangs out there to replicate that as well. So again, the Harrisons have the first decorated Christmas tree at the White House. So they are known for having that, and that Caroline and Benjamin Harrison both wanted all that special memories and joy for their grandchildren at that time. And I brought down also just a couple of other little things. The little cutout actually shows Benjamin Harrison and Caroline decorating, and it dates from about 1941. It's actually something they recreated later for a Christmas card. Macmillan and Company actually printed that, so showing Benjamin Harrison and Caroline decorating the tree at the White House. The little pillow that is laying there is another little piece of Caroline's. She's actually painted that pillow, and it has Mary Scott Harrison's initials and then Caroline's initials backwards, by the way, just as a little trick. And it says Merry Christmas and Happy New Year 1879. And then we have the Pine Cone Santa, which was a feature actually in an 1868 Ladies' Goatees magazine, where they showed you how you could make the pine cone Santa. So that's something that we have replicated. And you have the pine cones, the moss, the sheep's wool, the real fur. So he is all kind of, you know, natural materials. He has this little bag of toys, his bag of coal, in case you weren't so good that he could leave your coal in the stocking for you. And then we also have the feather tree. So the feather tree is made out of goose feathers, and I'm gonna pick up this little guy on top here and pass him around. So the goose feathers are split along the spine of the feather, and so they're just a big skinny, long little skinny piece. But as you wrap them around the wire, they sort of fluff out like this. So as you wrap the feather around, you're also taking a piece of florist wire and wrapping around with it as you go along. Now we don't know, exactly how the Harrisons decorated their Christmas tree, and the White House has the good description, and that it was, decorated from floor to ceiling, and have the candles that they lit. But unfortunately, we don't have a photograph of that tree. We don't have a photograph of any Christmas decorations here. So the stuff that we use is just all things that were typical of that time period and represented in other publications at that time. So feather trees were a German tradition to begin with, and it was an idea of having an artificial tree actually back in that time period. So again, the goose feathers, wrapping the feather around it, and then it's a wire in the middle that you're wrapping around, and we can pass the little feather around so you can feel what that is like. But the Christmas time was very special for the Harrisons and for the grandchildren in particular, that first Christmas in the White House. And I will open up our little book here to his section where he's talking about that. But does anyone have any we have other things upstairs. We have a snow tree. We have a lot of the Harrison dolls out for Christmas. So actually, a few of you would like to go out the front door. We can walk through the first floor, and you can see some of those other decorations as well this morning, if you like. So, any questions?
I know that Harrison's would have been